Hello, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the Aegean. The Aegean Sea is an elongated embankment of the Mediterranean Sea between Europe and Asia. It is located between the Balkans and Anatolia and covers an area of some 83,000 square miles. In the north, the Aegean is connected to the Marmara Sea, which in turn connects to the Black Sea by the Strait of the Dardanelles and Bosphorus. The Aegean Islands are located within the sea, and some bound it on its southern periphery, including Crete and Rhodes. The sea reaches a maximum depth of 11,627 feet to the east of Crete. The Thracian Sea and the Sea of Crete are main subdivisions of the Aegean Sea. The area that we are going to be talking about most is the Cyclades. Lying in the central Aegean Sea between the Greek mainland and the west Asia Minor, and to the east just north of Crete. This group of small barren islands played a role in Greek history already during the Neolithic period and till its present day. The Greek name Cyclades because they formed a circle, in Greek Kyklos, round the sacred islands of Delos. Today, the visitor standing on the highest peak in Delos is able to see Mykonos to the east, Tenos to the north, Syros to the west, and Naxos and Paros to the south. The area that we're going to look at is Naxos, because Naxos had a large amount of marble deposits on the island. And the sculptures that we're going to look at, the Cyclades sculptures, were most likely mined in Naxos. So the civilization of Cyclades developed in three major phases. 3300 to 2800 before Christ was the civilization of Pylos. 2800 to 2200 civilization of Keros and Saros, and then 2200 to 2000 Neos. The earliest settlements are Naxos, rather. The earliest settlements were located in the coastal sites, and in the beginning they were without walls and no kind of measures to guard them. But later, because of fear and pirates, the Cyclades people moved into the interiors of the islands and settled on the hills with sharp hillsides and fortified themselves with walls and towers. They lived in simple, straight-lined or curved houses in fortified settlements. The walls were made of mud and stone, and the roofs were lightweight, and they were made of reeds and branches woven together. The interior was plaster, varnished, and because of the mild climate, or even because of firewood storage, there was no hearth. So they didn't need to have, a fire to stay warm inside like we see in other northern France and southern France. They buried their dead in boxes that were shaped like the tomb of a trapezoidal shape, in circular ones and in chambers carved in the rock. Their religion consisted of a mixture of superstitions and magic. The excavations and research shows that the Cyclades people already had trade relations with mainland Greece and the coastal areas of Asia Minor and with the Western Mediterranean from the Neolithic period. And now here we can see some of the Cyclades sculptures and what they looked like. So very different than the Woman of Willendorf or the Lady of Brassempouy. We see here the kind of very basic shapes without heads and sort of a body form, eventually moving into these other types. So Plastiras, Loros, these are different places where they were found. The statuettes found throughout the Cyclades island are carved from this marble. Like statuettes of Neolithic times, they often depicted images of females, and some anthropologists will say that those are images of the mother. We also see here the image of maybe an instrument like a harp or some sort of musical instrument, and then the other looks like he might be blowing some sort of doubled flute. The other sculpture in Kairos from 2700. And here again we see the sort of female figures, and there's that image of the man with the harp. So the next area that we want to look at is Minoan, which is the island of Crete, but that's where the Minoans were. And the Minoan island was inhabited for some time. And what we're going to look at is the palace of Minoa, and we're going to look at on Knossos, and we're going to look at just like the differences about that palace. So on the island of Crete, around 3000 before Christ, it was settled by people who probably came from Asia Minor. And by 2000 before Christ, they were living in cities and trading with other nations in the Mediterranean and employing a hieroglyphic system of writing. And probably it was derived from Egyptian hieroglyphics. So you can see how these cultures would bring other technology like writing from other places and then and make it their own. And it would permeate the culture. They built magnificent palaces in the center of Knossos, Phaistos, and Zakros. These palaces seem to have dominated Cretan society. We have no idea what language they spoke, but they certainly spoke a non-Hellenic or non-Greek language. That is a language that is not related to Greek, and probably spoke a non-Indo-European language. So here's an overhead of the Palace of Knossos. And there we can see it's kind of on multiple levels. Their trade was extensive. The Egyptians were highly familiar with the Minoans. They even appear in Egyptian art. Minoan artifacts turn up all over Asia, and they seem to have been involved in trade with tribal clans living in Greece. So here's a cutaway of the palace. And there we can see how it's on multiple levels. They concentrated their merchant activity and produced great wealth for the Minoans. And that money or wealth went into massive building projects and art and technology development. The Minoans, for instance, seem to be the only people in the ancient world who would construct multi-room buildings for large parts of the society, even the most poor people. So nobody was left out, unlike other cultures where only the rich would have, the kinds of shelter and necessities. Knossos, we can see 2 paved courtyards, many storerooms, temples, private rooms, a theater, and some parts of the palace were 4 to 5 floors high with multiple staircases. And then they also had shallow alabaster steps that led to the upper and or underground floors. And then they would have openings in those floors. So you can see that sort of hole over on the right-hand side of this frame, right near the word Knossos. That would be like an opening that would allow light to move into different levels of the building. So something like that. And here we have another view of how that would work. So the light would come down into the different floors. Unlike other major cities, the palaces and towns of Minoans were thought to have no defensive works whatsoever throughout much of their history. So basically they didn't have big walls. And the reason why was because they were on an island. And so any ships that were coming to invade them, they could see from miles away, and they could understand that. So they could defend. The understanding is being seriously revised, though, as city defensive works are starting to be uncovered. These newly found defensive works, however, are not in the size and strength of any of the other Asian, or later we'll look at Mycenaean defensive works. The presence of only a small amount of defensive works in the archaeological records leads us to one conclusion, though it's tentative, that the Minoans throughout much of their history were relatively secure from attack, and they weren't worried about it. And so they could spend time doing other things like building and painting and ceramics and games and growing food and, just the things of life. So the Greek called any other people who didn't speak the Hellenic language barbaric, or the word they used was barbar, which literally means speaking nonsense, like bar, right? So that's what they thought, that these people were speaking nonsense. They called people who spoke barbaric languages barbarians. So the Greeks in many ways distinguished themselves from other people by the language that they spoke. So the Minoans and the Mycenaeans, for example, would be considered, or the Minoans especially, would be considered barbar or barbaric, even though they weren't. I think barbaric has kind of taken on a different term now. The Minoans enjoyed sports and seemed to be addicted to sports almost like Americans. The most popular sports were boxing and bull jumping. And there on the top we can see a big bull with two people, one on each end, and there's a guy in the middle who's literally doing an acrobatic, somersault over the top of the bull. So that we see many paintings of this throughout the Minoan art, and they really, it seemed to be something that they engaged in quite often. Women actively participated in all the sports. The immense concentration of wealth in such a small population led to an explosion in visual art. Unlike the bulk of most of the ancient world, the Minoans developed a visual culture that seems to have been solely oriented around pleasure, rather than being political or utilitarian or religious. The most apparent characteristic of Minoan religion was that it was polytheistic and matriarchal. That is, it was a goddess religion. The gods were all female. Not a single male god has been identified even in later periods. Many religious and cultural scholars now believe that most of the religions began as matriarchal religions, even the Hebrew religion. But, whether that's true or not, we don't know. Where Yahweh is frequently referred to as not having a gender, being that which has no name. So that which is all-knowing, that which is everywhere. So that gave, a different slant on this particularly patriarchal model that we start to see in later incarnations. The Minoans, however, do not seem to have evolved either gender equality nor adapted their religion to a male-centered universe. The head of the Minoan pantheon seems to have been an all-powerful goddess, which ruled everything in the universe. This deity was the mother deity. That is, her relationship to the world was a mother to offspring, which is fundamentally different than the relationship that the father would have to his offspring. Okay, so let's compare that now and contrast that to the other area in Greece that's right nearby, and that would be Mycenae. In the 2nd millennium BC, Mycenae was one of the major centers of Greek civilization. It was a military stronghold which dominated much of the southern Greece, Crete, the Cyclades, and parts of the southwest Anatolia. The period of Greek history from around 1600 BC to about 1100 BC is called Mycenaean in reference to Mycenae. At a peak in 1350 BC, the citadel and lower town had a population of 30,000 people and an area of about 79 acres. A pioneer in the field of archaeology, the German archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann is known for his excavations of ancient Troy and of ancient Mycenae. His discoveries were there later to establish a historical background for all the stories and legends that were told by Homer and Virgil. And that had fascinated Schliemann since he was a young man. And so his whole effort was to go out and see if these stories were true. And here we have a map of Mycenae with the Mycenaean citadel, a sketch of that. So the citadel at Turns is there. We can see kind of an where it's located, like in the higher region there, and then you can kind of see an overhead aerial view. Schliemann deserves great credit for creating methods where none existed before for archaeology, and for demonstrating that excavation can be more than a treasure hunt, that it can in fact be to restore knowledge of lost civilizations. So we really do want to credit Schliemann for that work. He continued investigations that are revealing an ever-widening horizons and to the what was really happening in pre-classical Greece, so anywhere from 6,000 to 1,000 before Christ. Before Schliemann, the civilization was not even known to have existed. On the edge of the Argolic Gulf, at a short distance from Napoleon, the Acropolis of Tiryns rises impressively on a rocky hill. The earliest human occupation on the hill goes back to about 5,000 before Christ. It was followed by successive settlements, but the remains have been destroyed almost completely by extensive construction of the Mycenaean age. The building of the fortifications of the hill began in the 14th century before Christ and was completed by the end of the 13th century. The Cyclopean, or like the Cyclops, which, the giants, so they call them Cyclopean walls, which surround the upper and middle and lower citadel, have a total perimeter of about 7 miles. So here we can see this is the what's known as the Lion's Gate, and we can notice the column between the two lions. And if you look at it, doesn't it look somewhat like the Minoan columns that we had seen at Knossos? So we think that even though the Mycenaeans, may have been at war most of the time, that they did, hire Minoan artists, because Minoan artists were very good at what they did. So there we can see the sculpture that probably was made by a Minoan. Within the walls of the citadel were planned the wall painted palace, the remaining public spaces, the Cyclopean tunnels, so these huge stone tunnels that led to storehouses and workshops. The town divided into block houses extended outside the walls and around the Acropolis, about 750 acres. Within the walls were planned the wall-painted palace. The Mycenaean thalos, or tomb, that's what they called their tombs, was thalos, subterranean burial chambers, roofed by a corbelled vault. So corbelled literally means where the stones are kind of placed, each one a little bit further in until it gets to be that triangle. So it kind of opens up the space a little bit. So, and they were approached by what was called a dromos, or an entrance, that narrow abruptly at the doorway, or the Greek word would be stomion, actually opening into the tomb chamber. The chamber of Thalamos is built of stone rather than simply being hewn out of the bedrock like we saw in the Cyclades. The Greeks sailed for Troy. When the Greeks sailed for Troy, their fleet was trapped by an unfavorable wind. The seer Calchas revealed that their misfortune was due to Agamemnon, who had boasted that he equaled Artemis in hunting. The winds would only change if Agamemnon's daughter Iphigenia was sacrificed. Agamemnon reluctantly agreed to the sacrifice, but Artemis herself whisked Iphigenia away from the altar and substituted a deer in her place. During the siege of Troy, Agamemnon offended the greatest of the Greek warriors, Achilles, when he took the girl Briseis with him, from him. Achilles' anger with Agamemnon furnished the mainspring of the plot to the Iliad. After the sack of Troy, Agamemnon acquired Cassandra, the daughter of King Priam, as his concubine, and took her home with him to Greece. Agamemnon had an unhappy homecoming. He was either blown off of course and landed in the country of Agathios, or he came home to his own land to find Agathes waiting for him. In either case, Agathes had become the lover of Clytemnestra, and the two together murdered Agamemnon and Cassandra shortly after their arrival. Agathes and Clytemnestra then ruled Agamemnon's kingdom, but were eventually killed by Agamemnon's son, Orestes, Orestes and Electra by some accounts. The homecoming of Agamemnon and its aftermath were favored subjects of Greek tragedy. And so what we have here is this tomb that Schliemann had thought was the tomb of Agamemnon, and that this mask was made for Agamemnon. But there's been a lot of research later that has said no, that mask was not made as old as Schliemann had said it was, but he was so desperate to find any kind of anything from Agamemnon that some people think that he made it up. So you can definitely, that would be a great subject matter for a paper to look up, the mask of Agamemnon and the controversy around it. So that is the end of the early part of the Greek history, the Aegean. Definitely some great sculpture. We've looked at some tombs, and then of course the whole controversy around Schliemann and his search for trying to prove the stories and myths of the ancient Greeks to be true. So next time we're going to look at ancient Greece.